So okay guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to repair and or modify a variety of different controllers for many different consoles. Now with that said, we're mostly going to be taking a look at the N64 controller and its dreaded joystick problems. Now with that said, let's get the rest of these controllers out of the way so we can take a look at the N64 controller and see what makes it tick. Now, I'm not going to be taking apart my gray one because I already done that and I didn't make a video on it, but if you guys are interested, this one uses primarily 3D printed parts. I will do a comparison video someday in the future comparing this one to a stock green controller that I got lying around, but overall the 3D printed parts have been doing good and I don't see any reason to take that controller apart. So I thought we would do some general maintenance to my green original N64 controller, which has never been taken apart before. Now with that said, it's fairly easy to take apart an N64 controller. There's only 9 screws you have to remove from the back to remove the whole backing to the controller itself, and to get at 2 of them you have to remove the memory card and or rumble motor pack if you got one on your N64 controller. Anyway, I'll have a diagram on screen now because this video doesn't do it justice, but there are 9 screws. 2 of them are under the memory pack or rumble motor slot and the rest are pretty much in the handles. Anyway, maybe one day we'll look at that rumble pack and see if we can internally mod one into this controller, but for now, it's going to be purely an external adapter, until I get around to making the video, of course. Anyway, taking the screws out is fairly simple, but like I said, these controllers are old, so getting them to turn and to turn freely is pretty difficult. You will have to put a lot of force and effort into the screws to get them to turn around and pretty much get them undone from the controller itself. It also does help to have a magnet nearby so you can pull them out because they do get stuck up on grime, dirt, and various other particles that get jammed in the screw hole over time. Anyway, I think I got all the screws out at this point in the video, but I do want to point this out because I made a video on it in the past and maybe some of you guys never seen it, so I will link it down below. But the cable tie spool that I made for the N64 controller is so far one of my favorite mods to this date, and if you guys want the model, it is down below in the description if you wish to 3D print your own. Anyway, once you got all the screws out, the 2 halves should just separate with pretty much ease. You don't really have to worry about the trigger itself on the controller. It comes attached to the back of the controller faceplate, so it ain't gonna fall out and you're not gonna lose it. So don't worry about that, and you can clean that whole back end assembly if you want at this point in time. If it's grimy or dirty, that piece is super easy to clean, and well, you can clean it even with the joystick, controller trigger attached. Anyway, the first thing we got to do to remove the joystick assembly is we got to remove the trigger button. That's fairly simple. It's just held on by tabs, bend the tab out of the way, pull the button off, and it pretty much comes off just like that. Now from here, you have 2 choices. You can try to remove the connector and find it's really difficult, or you could take the joystick assembly screws out and remove the whole assembly from the controller faceplate. Doing it like this is way easier because then you have more leverage on the cable and it helps with pulling the cable free from the cable connector. Now to remove this part from the controller, there's just 3 screws. This is the screwdriver I'm using, although I think the labeling kind of faded. Nope, it looks fine to me, but yeah, that's the screwdriver I'm using to accomplish this job. There's 3 screws holding that assembly onto the controller. All you gotta do is remove those 3 and the whole joystick assembly itself should come free. Anyway, before we pull on this assembly to free it, here's a zoomed in shot. I like to show you guys how to do this here. I use a flathead screwdriver to pry the connector free, although it is fairly difficult to get free. It may take you more than 1 attempt, so don't worry if you don't get it right away. Anyway, I got the connector free as you can see, but there is one thing I like to do, and that's to take note of which way this connector plugs in. Some N64 controllers have the tines so worn down you could probably plug it in backwards. I haven't seen anyone do that, although I don't want to be the first one to do that, so I'm going to tell you guys to do the same. Always check where the cable plugs in if you have to mark it on the PCB, that way you don't forget. But yeah, here's the assembly itself all pulled out of the controller, and overall this one's in fairly good shape. There isn't that much dust floating around in there, and overall the joystick itself springs back to the center just as it should. Now normally when it comes to these controller assemblies, you don't even have to take the controller apart to re-lube them. A lot of the lubrication for electronics is, well, electronics safe, so you could just spray it in there, but I stopped doing that recently because you can get dirt into the controller joystick assembly that way, and if any of that dirt lands on the encoding wheels, your controller won't perform as intended. Anyway, if you're wondering what causes the actual N64 joystick to become loose, it's typically the arms, the bowl, or the thumbstick itself. Here's some video on screen of those parts. They're fairly easy to source, and if you have a liquid printer, I suggest just printing out new ones. If you don't have a liquid printer, a lot of this can be printed on a traditional 3D printer as well. In fact, like I said at the start of the video, I've done that for my gray N64 controller, and so far I felt no difference between the two at all. Anyway, to get this assembly opened up, you'll notice there are some tabs. These tabs have to be pulled back, but before we can pull them back, you have to undo the screw. But while you're undoing this screw, keep the assembly under pressure. Keep it closed, because it is spring-loaded, and if it opens up too quick, that little screw may go flying. Just thought I'd give you guys a heads up there. But yeah, once you got the assembly and the screw out of the assembly, I should say, you can begin by pulling back on these tabs. They're fairly durable, but be careful because these controllers are super old. The parts can get brittle over time and they can crack, so keep that in mind, and if you need to, use a screwdriver to pry them up. Anyway, I did this kinda off cam, but I freed it up, and the parts come apart like this. As long as you don't throw the thing around, you're not gonna lose parts at this step. But just keep in mind the orientation and the way things go in. Anyway, you have a front half of the assembly and the back half. The front half is assembled like this. It's a spring, thumbstick, and then the arm to keep the spring tensioned. The primary reason why your joystick becomes loose over time is the little nubbin on the end of the thumbstick. If that nubbin's ground flat, you're probably not getting enough tension, which is why your spring or the joystick doesn't spring back to the middle center on the controller itself. Another reason why it might have issue is these arms. Sometimes the arms wear down, but overall, just giving this a quick once over, the parts look pretty good. I don't see any dust from the bowl wearing or the thumbstick. Overall, I just think it needs a quick bath and a little bit of lubrication, and we can put this thing back together. Anyway, to take out these parts, the arm comes off just like so, and the PCB itself isn't really held in by any kind of screw or pretty much any kind of tabbing method. You can just pull up on it and it comes free. Now store this part away, but make sure no dirt gets inside those sensors, because if dirt gets in the sensors, it's really hard to fix. But yeah, here it is, the actual bowl and encoder parts inside the joystick assembly. Most of this can be 3D printed. The encoders I'm not too sure about. You will need a liquid printer, but you could just order those parts online if yours happen to be broken. But yeah, this is the lubricant I use, and we're just gonna quickly bathe those parts in some water and dish soap before we go and apply some lubricant and put this thing back together. But yeah, one last thing to check. I kind of mentioned it, but I didn't really show it up close till now. This is the front half of the joystick assembly, and I'm going to show you guys how to fix it if it does come apart. It's fairly simple. Like I said, it's just a spring, the thumbstick, and then the washer. As long as you put everything in that order, it doesn't really matter which arm you put on top, because it only goes together one way, so you're not going to be able to mix those parts together. But yeah, as you can see, you just push pressure down on the spring, put that piece back on, and twist. Again, I didn't do a good job filming it, but trust me, this part is really simple to put back together. But yeah, if your thumbstick's worn down, the nubbin on the top, you will notice it will be flat, and that's why your controller has no tension, and that's why the joystick wiggles around. If you have that problem, replace the thumbstick. If you don't notice that on your thumbstick itself, it might be an issue with the bowl piece itself, and that part can also just easily be replaced or 3D printed. Anyway, I start off modestly. I add some lubricant to the bowl itself and the arm, and from there I add a little bit to the tip of the joystick itself. I don't really show it on cam, but I do place the halves together just to test fit before I put the thing completely together, and that gets some of the lubricant on the other piece, as you guys can see. I just make sure it gets all around evenly, and once I think I have enough on there, I can put it back together. Just keep in mind, with this lubricant, you can use a lot. Just make sure you don't get any on the sensors itself. If you block the sensors or dirt gets in the encoder wheels, for example, then the sensors won't be able to read where the movement of the joystick is, and you'll end up having issues in your game. Now, for those of you wondering why not order a new joystick, why am I going through all this effort? Well, it's because these joysticks are more precise than the new GameCube converted over ones. Now, what I mean by that is this works like an old school ball mouse. It uses positioning of the ball, in this case joystick, to determine its location in space in the game. And these have a more refined dead zone and things of that nature. So if you're trying to walk in The Legend of Zelda or something like that, you will walk slow unless you put a lot of force onto it, unlike a new joystick would. But yeah, we're going to start by putting this thing back together. As you can see, I got the bowl in place. It only slots in one way. And from here, you just slot in the PCB. Make sure, again, that you get no dirt or grime on the actual sensor itself before inserting it. But once you got it inserted, it just slots in place like so. And then we can begin actually putting this controller back together just by doing the reverse steps of what we already done. Now, actually putting these two parts together is a little bit tricky compared to taking it apart, but you just want to align everything up like a puzzle and push together. If you're having to put a lot of force into it, you probably don't got your parts lined up, so pull it out, try again. But as you can see, I've done this enough times and I'm able to get it first go. And I gave it a little test run there just to make sure everything's sliding around freely and that every part is where it should be. Anyway, that looks pretty good to me, so we can begin by putting in that little screw to keep the tension down on the assembly itself. That way we don't have to hold the thing shut anymore with our hand. Now, I gave it another test moving around because I want to make sure I have the tension right, and I want to make sure I have that screw turned in right and all the way. Anyway, from here, we just basically undo everything that we did to get up to this point. You just put the joystick assembly back in, reinstall the 3 screws that hold it down, then clip the connector back onto the controller itself. Anyway, I'm going to skip through the actual screwing of the screws into the joystick assembly and get to the part where we actually plug in the connector and everything. Anyway, as you can see, I got the connector in now, and from this point, you can actually test the controller out if you wish, believe it or not. Nothing's exposed, so you can just plug your controller in, test the feel of the thumbstick and stuff itself, and if it feels right to you, you can actually proceed with putting in all the other screws. Anyway, this is what it should look like now. Don't forget to put the actual trigger button back in. If you forget to do that, then your trigger won't work, obviously. But yeah, it just slides in like so, and it's fairly easy. In fact, this was way easier than with my gray controller. I was a little worried that I didn't actually have it plugged in at first. But yeah, from here you just reinsert the back plate of the controller itself. Put all 9 of them screws back in. Make sure your shoulder buttons are put back in place too. You don't want to leave those out. But yeah, it should just go back together. And before I forget to mention it, the actual, the trigger button is attached to the back plate itself. If you removed it, put it back on the back plate before you reinsert and reinstall the back plate of the controller itself. So alright, I wanted to do this part in real time just to show you guys that the controller works and that the cleaning and restoration was a success. As you can see, I got it plugged in, the cable spool is completely unwound, and from here we're going to turn it on and we're going to fire up The Legend of Zelda, I can't remember, Ocarina of Time, and it should just play flawlessly. So here we go, one of these shortcuts will start it, and one thing I like to suggest you guys to do is make sure your screws are in tight. Sometimes I like to keep mine a little loose, and that's a bad habit on my part. But for the most part, you want to also test out your buttons. Make sure you didn't move the membrane out of the way if you ended up taking the controller apart too far. But as you can see, it's working. My console didn't blow up. Here's the game. We'll just do something with some quick inputs with the thumbstick. As you can tell, if you played this game, you know I'll be using the thumbsticks. Here we go. As you can see, it works fine. And it actually feels pretty good. I'm surprised I didn't need any 3D printed parts to fix this. And it just needed some lube and it was good to go. But if your controller is really bad, the 3D printed parts do good. I actually use a completely 3D printed joystick assembly on my gray controller, and it works out great. I'll be sure to link those files down below in the description for those that want to download them. Anyway, now that I verified the controller works, I want to mention what controllers we're going to be taking a look at in the future. In the future, we're going to be taking a look at this 360 controller and this original wireless Xbox controller. Now, the original Xbox controller is pretty cool because it's designed to look like a 360 controller, but I think we can add some LED lighting underneath the joysticks, as well as replace the broken, chewed up joysticks with completely 3D printed ones. Overall, the 3D printed caps that I have currently as a temporary solution are doing great. I just think it would be cool if I printed something out in transparent filament and put some LEDs under them. But overall, that will be the future video. Is going to be me tearing down one of these two controllers and or modifying it and or cleaning it. But yeah, with that said, I'm going to leave today's video off here now. DTPK signing off. Peace. Now in my case, I made these for my controllers and I think they came out great, and I thought maybe you guys would want to know how I embody. And you basically want to cut up a section of your fairy string into 4 LEDs.